I'd like to welcome everyone to the first day of the Hildebrand Project's 11th annual summer seminar on the Personalist vision. It's great to see so many of you joining us here virtually. Uh, so many, I see the names of so many good friends of the Hildebrand Project, and also the names of many of you that we'll be getting to know over the course of the next few days. My name is John Henry Crosby. I'm the founder and president of the Hildebrand Project. I'll be one of the hosts for you as the week unfolds. And all of us are very excited to spend the next 4.5 days with you as we explore our seminar theme. Now, we know from the applications and from those of you who've signed up that there are many reasons that have brought you to the seminar. Some of you want to go deeper into personalism. Others of you are new to personalism and want to know what it's all about. Others of you know something about the personalism of John Paul II or of Jacques Maritain or the other great personalist figures, and you wonder whether all of these various personalisms hang together into some kind of unified whole. And some of you have more practical and real-world concerns. Some of you are interested in how personalism can shape your work as teachers and mentors and guides, as doctors and lawyers, as priests, religious evangelists, as citizens, friends, and family members. If any of these and other possible questions that you might have, if any of this resonates with you, then you've come to the right place. So before I introduce our first two panelists this morning, just a very brief word on the format. So each of our panelists will speak about 10 to 12 minutes or just a little bit over. After that, the session chairs will lead off with some questions, but of course we'll be looking for your questions through the chat feature. So I invite you both during the presentations themselves and certainly immediately after to be submitting your questions. And I today and other session chairs throughout the seminar will be posing those questions to our speakers. So please don't be shy. Please make sure you submit your questions as they come to mind. So without further ado, just a quick word of introduction for our first speakers this morning. We have in order, Dr. John F. Crosby, a co-founder of the Hildebrand Project, professor of philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, the founder and director for many years of the graduate program in philosophy. Dr. Crosby has devoted his career to philosophical personalism, the development of this personalist vision. He was a student himself of Dietrich von Hildebrand in the last 11 years of von Hildebrand's life, and also a student and disciple in the early years of the papacy of John Paul II, of John Paul himself, through my father's teaching for many years at the Institute for Marriage and Family in Rome. We also have with us Mark Spencer, professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. Mark is, among many other professional associations, an associated scholar of the Hildebrand Project, where he is a fellow in metaphysics and aesthetics. Mark is one of our great collaborators in this work of spreading personalist thought, and we're very happy to be featuring him and Dr. Crosby this morning as we introduce the topic of our seminar. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Crosby.
Right. Thank you, John Henry, and welcome everyone to our week together in this seminar on the personalist vision. Now, you will wonder what exactly the personalist vision of the individual human being is. What is it about man that is especially stressed by personalism and gives rise to a personalist vision of man? I'll address this, and then my friend Mark Spencer will follow up along the same line. There is a mysterious individuality of the human person. It lies in the fact that each person is unrepeatable, can never be replaced by another person. Persons are never interchangeable with each other. If a person goes out of existence for good, a hole is created in the world that can never be filled by any subsequent person. So this is the aspect of the personalist vision that I want to introduce. Let me explain this by way of a contrast. Within plant species and within many animal species, individuals are interchangeable with each other. But individual human persons are not interchangeable. With flowers, for example, it is important only that there be some individual instances of a flower species. But whether the individual that instantiates the species be this individual or that one makes no difference. They are interchangeable with each other. In all the different kinds of interest we can possibly take in flowers, there is no basis for preferring this individual flower to that equally good instance of the same flower species. All we can possibly want is a flower of a species. Any healthy flower will do, but this one can always be replaced by that one. If a flower wilts and dies, but reproduces itself before dying, then its offspring completely replaces the parent flower. And anything that could have interested us in the parent flower will interest us equally in the offspring. The offspring is so interchangeable with the parent that there is no sense of loss about the death of the parent. The individual flower is completely dominated by its species. It is a mere carrier of it, a mere instance of it. This is what makes flowers interchangeable with one another, and what makes it impossible for our interest in flowers to fix precisely on this one here, to the exclusion of all others of the same species. But with human persons, it is completely different. They are not dominated in the same way by the human species, but, as has often been said, each person stands, in a sense, above the human species, or better, each contains something in excess of the human species, or contains some personal identity irreducible to the identity we have as a human being. Consider the different kinds of interest we can take in a human person. We can take an interest in one person that does not extend to others, but is only an interest in this one. If this one is my friend, then a replacement is absolutely out of the question. There is no one with whom he or she is interchangeable. I do not just want a friend of a certain description, but I want this one and no other. The death of a human being who was my friend inflicts a sense of loss such that no subsequent human person can possibly compensate for that loss. So what I want to say is that we can't begin to understand the personalist vision of man if we fail to grasp the abundance of individual being that we point to when we say something in excess of the humankind, something more than an instance or carrier of it, something that prevents it from being interchangeable with every other human being. Now, you might think that this has been known for a long time and that I'm just belaboring the obvious. Is there really here some new insight of personalism? The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor helps us to answer this question. Speaking of the German thinker Herder, Charles Taylor writes, Herder put forward the idea that each of us has an original way of being human. Each person has his or her own measure, is his way of putting it. This idea has entered very deep into modern consciousness. It is also new. Before the late 18th century, no one thought that the differences between human beings had this kind of moral significance. There is a certain way of being that is my way. I am called upon to live my life in this way and not in imitation of anyone else's. But this gives a new importance to being true to myself. End of that quote from Charles Taylor And in another work, he's exploring this new sense of the significance of differences among human beings. And he says, the differences are not just unimportant variations within the same basic human nature, or else moral differences between good and bad individuals. Rather, they entail that each one of us has an original path which we ought to tread. They lay the obligation on each of us to live up to our originality. Charles Taylor is clearly aiming at what I have been calling the unrepeatability of each person. And he clearly wants to say that we are today aware of this unrepeatability in a way in which people were not aware of it, even just a few centuries ago. He even wants to say that a growing sense of persons as unrepeatable is a defining feature of our time. Now, we philosophers work out our ideas by raising objections to them. One objection to what I've been saying is that we often treat human persons as interchangeable and do so without offending anyone's moral sensibilities. For example, a job description is drawn up and someone is hired who fits it well. When that person leaves the job, someone else is hired who we can easily imagine equally well fits the job description. So the first holder of the job is completely replaced by the second holder of it. Aren't the two workers interchangeable? This objection would have force only if the job description completely expressed the identity of a worker who corresponds to it. But in fact, the job description abstracts from most of the identity of the worker, and certainly abstracts from his unrepeatable identity as person. The job description picks out a few skills of a worker that happen to be of interest to his employer and prescinds from everything else in the worker. These skills can indeed be repeated in different workers, but this in no way interferes with the personalist idea that at a deeper level, there is something in each of the workers that is unrepeatable. And notice this extraordinary fact. The job description is clearly articulated in concepts. Very definite things are specified as wanted by the employer. Whereas the unrepeatable mystery of a person cannot be conceptualized at all. It is ineffable, unutterable. It clearly lies in a much deeper place in the person than the place where job skills are found. But there's a more challenging objection that might be raised and perhaps is on your minds as you listen to me. Some say that this stress on the unrepeatability of each person is dangerous. It obscures what we have in common, so the objection goes, and exaggerates what divides us. In order to avoid a bad, destructive individualism, we have to stress, so the objection, above all else, what we have in common, and forget about what is my own and not another's. The best way to answer this objection is to point to the experience of loving a person. We love a person when we have a vision of the person as unrepeatable. In fact, no one sees the mystery of the unrepeatable person like the one who loves him or her. Without love, we see only attractive qualities in a person, qualities that can exist in other persons. So we may be drawn to a person in virtue of his intelligence and humor, but we do not really love that person because we will be even more drawn to someone else who has greater intelligence or greater humor. We love the qualities, not the person. But the truth of love is this. This is a fundamental personalist affirmation that our love is love for the other person and not just for his or her lovable qualities. And our love reaches the other person only when we apprehend the other as unrepeatable person. Now back to the objection that we undermine the unity of all persons when we stress the unrepeatable identity of each. How could we possibly undermine the unity of all persons if it is precisely the unrepeatable identity of a person that, when experienced, awakens in us love for that person? If persons are brought together mainly by love, and if love for a person is engendered by the sight of the unrepeatable mystery of that person, then our insistence on the unrepeatability of each person, far from isolating persons from each other, enables us to understand how it happens that persons can come to be united in love. To this response, I would add that the kind of differences among people that lead to conflict are differences in virtue of which some people feel superior to others. So Greeks feel superior to barbarians, and men superior to women, and whites superior to blacks, and so on. But the unrepeatable mystery of a person does not establish a person in a position of superiority or inferiority to others. Rather, as unrepeatable persons, we are incommensurable with one another. We exist in a space in which there are no hierarchical rankings. I would just add that our common human nature is indeed a significant bond of unity among us human beings, just as the objection claims. Our friend David Brooks, who will speak this afternoon, has thought deeply about this communitarian dimension of personalism. So it's certainly true that bad things happen when we lose sight of this primordial unity that we have as fellow human beings. But equally bad things happen when we treat persons as interchangeable. Our unity as sharers in human nature is a unity based not on fusion or on blending, but on the unrepeatable identity of each person. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby.
Yeah.
And I want to pick up right there and develop a number of further themes that are central insights of personalism. So Dr. Crosby discussed how persons are unrepeatable and how we are not reducible to merely being instances of the human species. And I want to pick up on that theme of irreducibility, because I think this is a real central insight of personalism, that human persons are not reducible to anything non-personal. That is, we can't say of human persons that we are nothing but, and then fill in the blank with anything other than a person. That is, it's not the case that we are nothing but matter. We are not just our bodies. We are not just parts of society. Furthermore, we are not just expressions of other persons' intentions, even God's. That is, I am not merely an instrument of God, much as I ought to conform myself to the divine will. I am self-possessed. I belong to myself. This, I think, is one of the key insights of personalism. Dr. Crosby mentioned the experience of love as a motivation for thinking that human persons are not reducible, are not repeatable. Let me mention a couple of other pieces of evidence that personalists turn to in order to motivate this idea of irreducibility. One experience that a lot of personalists turn to is this experience that we have of our own subjectivity. I experience myself as a self. I experience my acts as my own. When I think, when I will, when I love, when I just feel things in my body, I experience these acts as belonging to myself. This experience of subjectivity is prime evidence that I am not reducible to my matter, my physical structure, merely being a part of society. I experience this self-possession. One particular sort of subjective experience that personalists often turn to is not just subjectivity in general, but the experience of freedom. I experience myself not just as belonging to myself, but as being able to determine myself. I am able to, within certain limits, determine the course of my own life. Not only do I choose among options, say I go to a restaurant and I choose things off the menu, I'm not just choosing things out there in the external world, I'm choosing what I am going to become. I am governing the course of my own life. So this experience of being able to determine myself is yet further evidence that I am not nothing but something other than a person. When personalists think about the human person, they often think about persons as having, as it were, sort of two poles, two aspects. And Dr. Crosby touched on this a bit towards the end of his talk. I experience myself as belonging to myself. Right? There's a sense in which I am sort of in solitude, even sort of isolated from other people, insofar I belong to myself and have all of my acts as my own. That's one pole, this belonging to myself, being separated from all other people. But on the other hand, because I am free, because I possess myself, I am able to give myself as a gift to others. This can happen through love relationships, like Dr. Crosby talked about, can happen through friendship, through marriage, through entering into political life, as a teacher, giving myself to my students through discussion and lecture, through a parent giving themselves to their child, lots of different sorts of relationships. We are able to give ourselves, make a gift of ourselves to others. So we've got these two poles. On the one hand, we are in solitude, we belong to ourselves. On the other hand, we are open to others. Hence, a lot of personalists emphasize the fact that we are fundamentally dialogical beings. That is, we are beings in dialogue, in conversation with others. Although I possess myself, although I cannot fully belong to anyone other than myself, I only become a self in conversation, in relationship with other people. And we see this in young children, the way in which they come into a sense of themselves through a relationship with their parents, their friends, and so forth. But we see it in adults as well. In order for me to have a sense of my own identity, a sense of this belonging to myself, I need to enter into relationship with others. So again, there we see these two poles. I belong to myself, I am separate from other people, and yet I go beyond myself and enter into relationship with others. Hence, personalism thinks, as Dr. Crosby emphasized, that we have a fundamental solidarity with all other persons. That is, we're in this together. Human beings belong in community with other people, but a community based around not power relationships, but based on self-gift, in which I make a gift of myself to others and I receive others giving themselves to me. Historically speaking, personalism developed in opposition to a number of depersonalizing movements. So personalism really gets going towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in opposition to movements like totalitarianism and fascism and communism and other sorts of ideologies which would reduce the person to merely being a part of society. But personalism also arises in opposition to individualism, to views that would see us as entirely just isolated individuals, entirely self-interested individuals, just looking for our own fulfillment, our own flourishing, the satisfaction of our own rights and needs and desires. Personalists frequently contrast being a person to being an individual. Individual emphasize that isolated aspect of the person. Person, on the other hand, balances the fact that I do belong to myself, and yet I am inherently open to others. So a personalist vision is always going to emphasize that aspect of self-gift. One final feature of persons that I want to mention here as I think a real central insight of personalism is personalists often emphasize that human beings are spiritual beings. And I want to explain what this means. So to be spiritual means precisely what I've been talking about, this ability to go beyond the self and make contact with others. We do this through our intellectual activity when we grasp the reality of other persons and non-personal beings. We do this through our wills when we make a sincere gift of self to another and determine my life to go in a direction whereby it is open to others. We do this through our feelings when these feelings are open to being moved by others. For example, when I am moved by the beauty of a painting, a musical work, or another person, when I am moved by adoration for God, moved by devotion to another person or to a noble cause. Each of these experiences of going beyond myself, giving myself over to something other or someone other than myself, is what's meant by the spirituality of the human person. Now, when personalists talk about persons as spiritual, this is not meant to be in opposition to being physical or bodily beings. We are, on many personalist formulation of it, embodied spirits or incarnate spirits. I live my spirituality, my being a spirit, through my body, my perceptual acts, my physical actions that I perform towards others can be entirely spiritual. So Dr. Crosby talked about how we are not the same as other animals, not mere instances of a species. And we see this in the way in which we live out our bodily lives. Human beings don't just merely act in a purely biological or purely physical way. Rather, our biology, our physical aspects have been taken up into our spiritual life, such that the things I do with my body express my intellect, my will, my affections, and so forth. So there's going to be an emphasis on the spiritual, but without any hint of a sort of dualism or an opposition between spirit and body. The only opposition that personalists are going to emphasize is this opposition between person and individual, which represent two ways in which I can live out my life. Do I live it out in a selfish manner, a way that is entirely focused on just satisfying my own private needs? That's being an individual. Do I live out my life in a way that is open to others, giving myself to others? That's to live fully as a person. We will see as we go along through the rest of the sessions today and the rest of this week that there are a great many other insights that personalists provide to us. But I think between what Dr. Crosby and I have talked about, that we've got a good basis here, I think, for getting started. Thanks to everyone for being here.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for those thoughtful opening remarks. So I would point out to you both as speakers that you're welcome to take a look at the questions that are coming in through the chat. I will lead off with a couple of them here and continue to invite our audience to submit the questions through the chat feature. There are a number that are coming through the Q&A feature. There are a number coming through the chat, but we'll be looking specifically in the Q&A function for your questions. So a question that's been raised in a couple of different ways by several speakers here have to do with this issue of self-possession and God. So I'll read one question. In what sense are persons self-possessed rather than belonging to God? It seems true that God is more myself than I am. To this person's quoting this kind of language that we see often among the mystics and in discussions of our sense of divine providence and so on, God being closer to me than I am to myself. And a related question, which I'll just pose at the same time, is how can beings which are so individual to be unrepeatable have one and the same final end? Do not Christians believe that we all have one and the same final end, the beatific vision? So maybe those are two good questions to pose to both of you in an effort to also clarify the concepts that you all have been presenting here. So I'll let Professor Crosby, maybe I'll let you go first, and then Mark,
Yeah.
you can say something. I have to apologize to the audience. I think I'll be struggling between Dr. Crosby and Dad throughout this session. So
That's right.
for those of you who were wondering, it is indeed the case.
Yes.
Father and son here. Anyways, Dr. Crosby.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Crosby, founder of the Hildebrand Project. Take that first question on the self-possession of persons. I think that everything we would want to say about belonging to God and even being filled with God and possessed by God coheres in the end with the fact that we belong to God as person. God doesn't forget the different kinds of things he's created. And so it's not as if this belonging of each person to himself is canceled out by the fact that it's God that I'm related to. One way in which Karol Wojtyła, great personalist about whom we'll be speaking a little later, stresses this is to show what respect God has for the free yes of each person. He doesn't coerce. Yes, he respects our freedom. And if our answer is no, he respects even that. So I think one can say that he wants a union with himself, which is an exercise of that free self-gift of which Mark spoke. He doesn't absorb us in a way that shuts down this belonging of the person to himself and the capacity for making a free gift of himself. It would be, I think, a really bad depersonalization of us human persons if we thought of God as somehow absorbing, inhabiting, completely taking over, reducing us to a mere extension of himself. That would be violence done by God to his own creation. That's just not the way he calls us and works with us. So I'd want to hold fast to self-possession, self-gift, self-determination, even, or rather, most of all, in relation to God. Yeah, now, Mark, you may want to add something to that.
I would agree with all of that. So the question sort of posed this in Augustinian terms, right? St. Augustine talks about how God is more interior to me than my inward self, right? So there's a sense in which God is more me than I am myself. And I think that's an insight that the personalist can appropriate, but in a particular way. So on this sort of older St. Augustine sort of view, creatures have their properties by sharing in God's properties. So beautiful things have their beauty by sharing in God's beauty, and good things have their goodness by sharing in God's goodness. The world is a sort of expression or sacrament of God. And I think the personalist can pick up on this idea where human beings, human persons share in God uniquely, or persons in general. I suppose angelic persons would as well. Where we share in God is we share in his freedom. So God is not only perfect and infinite goodness and beauty and truth and so forth, but God is perfect freedom. And what God has done on this personalist vision, I think we could say, is God has given us a genuine share in that freedom. But to share in God's freedom, to share in freedom, requires that we be genuinely free. Right? And to be free is to in a sense, be separated from others to the extent that I need to be able to possess that freedom so that I can use it to make that gift of self that Dr. Crosby was talking about. And so there's a sense here in which we can enter into the very deepest sort of relationship with God precisely because we share in him in this distinctive way. To the other part of the question about the human end, I think that most personalists are going to want to sort of balance two aspects here. So Dr. Crosby talked about how we do have a common nature. Right? We are all human beings. We have human nature, and human nature gives us certain powers, certain abilities. And those abilities can only be perfectly fulfilled by reaching certain ends, certain goals. And on the Christian vision, the end that's going to most perfectly satisfy and fulfill all our powers is union with God. But the personalist is also going to emphasize that we're not just instances of that common nature, but we are distinctive, that we have something in excess of that nature. And so the way in which I live out human nature, the way in which I live out those human powers is going to be distinctive to me. Dr. Crosby and I each have an intellect, but we express that intellect in distinct ways. We each have a will, but we express that will in distinct ways precisely because we are distinct persons. And so I think the personalist is going to want to say, although the end of every created person is union with God, that union is different in some way for each person. The way in which I shall be united to God, the way in which God gives himself to me and I give myself to God is different than the way Dr. Crosby does.
Yeah.
Dr.
Yeah,
Crosby.
no, that seems to me quite right. That idea that Charles Taylor brings up, this distinct measure of humanity, that I alone live. Why shouldn't that play into and somehow give a stamp to the final union with God that I hope to have? Some personalists have suggested too that this idea of the image of God should be thought like this, that each person through their personal uniquenesses images something a little different. It's the same God, but still there is an imaging that I alone, that maybe brings out the special dignity of person, that each one of us can image some particular glory or mystery of God that we alone image and is tied to our being this unique person.
Dr. Jim Beauregard asks in the chat, in dialogical personalism, person is sometimes seen as created by a relationship. And I spoke in my remarks about how we are only fully persons in our relationship with others. And Dr. Beauregard asks, is this problematic to say that dialogue or interaction is prior ontologically, that is more fundamental to being a person? Or is it better to see that persons are more fundamental and that we're drawn out by relations with others? And I take it that a big worry here, and maybe this is a worry that many of you had as I made my remarks, is it makes it sound that persons are not persons until we enter into that relationship with persons, such that, say, babies would not be persons, right? In as much as they can't enter into this fully conscious relationship with persons. Some mentally impaired persons or cognitively impaired persons might not be persons, it might sound like. And I certainly want to block that implication. That's certainly not the view of the personalists that we'll be discussing here this week. Nevertheless, personalists want to emphasize this aspect of relationality. Persons are beings who are in relation. But that relationality is more fundamental than conscious relationality. To be a person is always to be in relation with other persons, because created persons are brought into existence by other persons. So to be what I am is to be in relationship with God who created me. It's to share in God's freedom, God's attributes, God's love. To be a person is to be brought into existence by other human persons, and so have a relationship in what I fundamentally am to those other human persons, whether I'm conscious of it or not. So I think the personalist wants to say both we are fundamentally relational, and that is more fundamental than any conscious relations we enter into, but we sort of fully come into our own by consciously living out those relationships.
Right.
And so there's sort of relationality on both sides there.
Right. Maybe one could introduce, Mark, what do you think, the concept from the Aristotelian metaphysics of a being actualizing itself, and say that in our encounter with other persons, we're not brought into being out of nothing. We bring an already existing personhood, but that personhood can be actualized. The fullness of self-possession, of the capacity for self-gift, for self-transcendence, all of that gets actualized in the encounter with other persons, especially love-like encounters. So we think of others as giving us not our very being as persons, but actualizing it. That perhaps captures the distinction you were rightly making.
Thank you.
There are a number of questions here that ask, that imply either a word, well, I should say imply not a critique by the questioners, but a worry about the use of the term person itself. So I want to read just one question from our friend in Poland, Pavel Pias, who asks whether there's a risk that the concept of person is a kind of cultural artifact of Judeo-Christian culture. And he mentions that there's empirical data indicating that there's an important difference between Western cultures and Eastern cultures on the understanding of this concept. And I think most of us are familiar with this, that in the West, we tend to think of ourselves first as individuals and then members of a group. And that conceptual hierarchy is reversed often in Eastern cultures, with the sense of being a member of a community coming prior to that strong sense of the individual. And I can add to that an article I recently read in the New York Times in which it was observed that when, for example, in an Asian family, a family member gets cancer, often the family doesn't inform that family member and simply makes all the decisions about the care on that person's behalf. So that perhaps is an extreme and maybe not true in every instance, but I think in a Western context, we would find that to be quite problematic. So I wonder if either of you could comment on this concern that we're speaking about this notion of the person in very metaphysical and philosophical, a strong sense of having come upon the essence of something, but there's this perhaps this pushback that we're neglecting to recognize the historical or cultural dimensions of the concept of person.
Yeah. Well, maybe one just jump in, or did you, Mark, want to?
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. I think of the fundamental personalist idea that persons are never rightly used in an instrumental way, never rightly treated as mere parts of a whole, like the cells in an organism. And it seems to me that notion, persons are violated when instrumentalized, has wide resonance in the consciences of people East and West. And that's a sign of personhood as being something real and transcultural that is somehow making itself felt in our thinking and moral judgment. So that's certainly no construct that or peculiarity of a particular culture, that persons are never rightly used. If anything is transcultural, surely that is. And that points to a certain, you might say, essential structure of the human person that we are aiming at by using the term person. Mark, what do you
Yeah, I mean, I would.
add to that?
I think the questioner is right to note that the concept of person, as we're using it, and the term person certainly has a Western history. We find roots of this idea of person certainly in the controversies over the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of Christ. It gets developed a great deal there in the Christian tradition. We find it earlier in the use of words that eventually turn into the English word person in the Greek theater, right, where the person is the mask or the role that an actor plays. We find it in the Roman legal tradition. But we also find analogs or cognates of the word person in the Indian languages, where there's a similar sort of concept. But it certainly has been developed in the West. That said, I would just emphasize what Dr. Crosby said. The ideas here, this idea of needing to make a gift of ourselves, needing to transcend ourselves, to aim at what is spiritual, to aim at what is higher. All of those sorts of things we find quite well developed in Eastern religions and cultures, and also Native American and African, and lots of, I mean, any human culture has these ideas. So I would think what the way we should think of this is the concept of person as it has developed in the West is developing features of human life, emphasizing features of human life that everybody everywhere experiences, but maybe have not been thematized as well as they should have.
Yeah.
Well, we have time for just perhaps one more question. I don't know if either of you are drawn to anything that you see in the chat. And while you all take a look, let me just say to all of you submitting these wonderful questions that obviously with 35 questions here and now, we won't be able to address that number in every panel. So what I think I'm trying to do, and what our other panelists, moderators will try to do, is to recognize that some of these questions have entire sessions devoted to them. And so rather than trying to answer them in this context, for example, questions around sexuality or embodiment, those are questions that will come in sessions still to come. So don't feel neglected. Keep the questions coming. They're very, very good. We will also be looking through these questions as we put together the very final panel in which we will take as a question the topic of the seminar, which is, what is the personalist vision? In other words, looking back on the conversation we'll have had these 4.5 days, is there anything that has emerged with particular clarity and force? So please keep the questions coming, and know that we are, through this seminar itself, attempting to answer all of them. Mark or Professor Crosby, any particular questions that stand out here that you'd like to comment on? Some of them are addressed to you directly.
I have one here. Patrick Jobst asks, how do you contrast the radical freedom of Sartre and the modern world with the type of freedom that is essential to personalism? Is it a matter of metaphysical truths accepted in the Catholic tradition, that is, God exists, and Sartre's rejection of essence that leads his brand of freedom into a vastly different ethical space than the personalist? So Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the mid-20th century French existential philosopher, has this idea of freedom as sort of radical self-creation. Right? I decide what I become. I don't have a nature given to me by God. There's no sort of moral law implanted within me that I am beholden to. Rather, I decide what I am going to become. And obviously, from what Dr. Crosby and I have said, that the personalist vision is rather different in as much as personalists, at least Christian personalists, have this idea that human beings do have a common nature, that we are beholden to living in accord with that nature, and that we do have an end given to us by God. Nevertheless, I think that personalists can learn a great deal from people like Sartre and other contemporary philosophers who emphasize our radical freedom. Although on the personalist vision, we ought to live in accord with our given nature, and we ought to pursue union with God. Nevertheless, on this vision, there is a genuine sense in which it is radically up to me whether I will do that or not. And so I think a genuine sense in which the personalist can say, I do create myself. I do determine the course of my own life. Not in the sense that I don't have a God-given nature, but in the sense that I have to appropriate that for myself or not. It is up to me whether I am going to live in accord with it or not. I have to put the stamp of my sort of my own owning it, possessing it, right? Appropriating it for myself or not. And so for that reason, I think the personalist can accept a great deal of the modern conception of freedom, but with these very important additions.
Maybe just to tie this line of questioning up with one final question to you, Dr. Crosby, because I think this reflects maybe this would allow for a certain sharpening of the concept of self-determination. Question is, there's so many ways in which we can't determine our own lives, given our formation situations, personal circumstances, historical circumstances. Could we comment further on how a person can determine his or her path within the context of all of these limits? So what I hear there is that this language of self-determination, self-creation may strike some people as maybe more of an ideal than something that they feel that they can realize in their own immediate lives. So in what respect is self-determination and self-creation possible, even in circumstances with extraordinary limits? For example.
Well, the point is often made that people who are dealt a very hard hand in life with many deprivations still have the power in their self-determination of saying yes to those circumstances and working with them and finding the possibilities that are always there in hard and great deprivation. So when you survey your condition and see how much is already set for you, how somehow the terms of your existence are already set without your consent, there is still, like the great Kierkegaard said, this choice you have. Do you will to be the self that you are, or do you in rebellion refuse to be that self? That's a profound act of self-determination. And it's exercised just in relation to this already givenness of the circumstances of life. And it's not just a servile acceptance. As I say, our experience is that all kinds of possibilities show up when hard circumstances are accepted in a grateful spirit. That all kinds of things become possible thanks to that self-determination. They don't take away all the liabilities that we've inherited, but still there's a space for significant creative freedom. So it's not at all the case that we have to be able to name all the terms of our existence in order to really have self-determination.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. That was a wonderful first session in which to begin our discussion of the personalist vision, a look at these foundational categories in which personalists think. And I think a lot of clarification already of the sort of questions that I see coming up in the chat here from our audience. So we're going to take just the briefest of breaks before moving on to our next session, in which we'll be looking at two great personalist figures, Karol Wojtyła and Dietrich von Hildebrand. So stay with us, and we'll be continuing shortly.